Good morning, Carol. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Yeah, really good, really good. We are just discussing connecting a pitch dark Oregon to a pitch dark London across the time zones at the moment. So enjoying this
Yes,
time of year. Um,
it's very, very dark here.
but it's
And
great
it
to have,
too, so it's even darker than yesterday was beautiful, but
we'll just have to enjoy the artificial lighting for the moment. Yeah. And thank you so much for taking the time to join this series of Sentientist Conversations. And you're also very kind to send me an advance copy of your amazing book, The Creative Lives of Animals, which I believe is out on the 22nd of November. I'm not sure when this will be published, but hopefully just in time for the launch. So it was a fascinating read, and it's great to get the chance to talk to you, partly because you refer to people like Marc Bekoff and Jessica Pearce, who I've been lucky to interview already, and Laurie Marino is another who I have plans to interview in the future. So we have some connections amongst previous guests already. Yeah. And as you know, this is a series of conversations about what I think of as the two deepest philosophical questions: the epistemological question of what's real and how should we understand reality. You okay? Gesundheit.
what's real? True.
And the second question, just as important, the one of ethics, right? What matters, and also who gets to matter, who warrants our compassion and moral consideration. And I have a bias in the conversation because I'm trying to popularize and develop this really simple worldview called Sentientism, which suggests we should take a naturalistic approach to epistemology and understanding reality, and we should take a sentiocentric approach to our moral scope. So every sentient being, any being that can experience suffering or flourishing, should matter in our ethical system, whatever that might be. But I'm lucky in these conversations to talk to a dazzling array of people who agree and disagree with that worldview. So it'll be great to understand your own personal journey through those big philosophical questions. But before we get to those, how would you best introduce yourself for people who don't know you already?
Let's see. Well, I've had a very varied career that has, at this point, kind of long. Another way of saying I'm older, and I started out as an actress, believe it or not, and which actually has come in very handy for many situations. Um, and then decided that I really didn't like saying other people's words. So I really committed to art and went back and got a master's in printmaking. And about that time, too, I became much more involved in animal rights, actually, and that was, good Lord, the 70s. So even though I had been pretty much vegetarian since I was 16, off and on, but I really committed to it, and my work as well, my visual artwork. And then when I was in my 40s, I went back to get a doctorate from the Advanced Computing Center for Arts and Design. And I wanted to do animation and use animation in my work, but I ended up writing a dissertation and found out that I was actually a good writer, which I always thought I had been terrible. So this was a big surprise. And I
Revelation.
really enjoyed it. And I felt like I had a lot to say. The words just sort of tumbled out. But my visual work was about animals. There's a series called the Dante series that I did, that actually I just did an interview with Culture and Animal Foundation. And that was in their archives because I knew Tom Regan and Nancy Regan really well. And I had met them through that piece. So our project, it's 9 very large pieces. And it's based on Dante's Inferno, but it's about animal experimentation. So in any case, I wrote about ethics and technology when I was involved in that kind, philosophy of technology, but mostly ethics. And people at that point, and it's not as if ethics hadn't existed before, but in the arts, people would come up to me and say, "Just don't say the word ethics."
Yeah.
So that was kind of tough. And then I I actually did something that made the art world, a lot of people in the arts, very angry, and that was to criticize biotechnology or bioart. And I had lots of friends in the arts who no longer are really my friends, but that's okay. I mean, I struck a nerve, and that was in the 2000s. So anyway, it really, I think, made me realize that this was something that needed to be done. That at the time, too, people were using animals in their work as material.
Yeah.
As objects, and that made me very upset in bioart, but in other forms of performance and installation. And so then I began to write quite a bit about animals, and I found my peeps in animal studies. I always wrote politically and socially, so critical animal studies was something that I did, and then I really worked hard on and helped to develop. And at this point, I was up at Emily Carr University of Arts and Design, and it's a great school and a great place to be and great colleagues. But I still got I still got a lot of backlash, which is interesting because I'm retired now, even though I'm writing constantly. And I work every day, and I keep reminding myself, you don't have to work every day. But I find that the art world has changed its tune, and that people have really started to clue into the fact. I mean, a lot of artists, of course, had started to do that a long time ago. Eco artists, that a big group of eco artists from New York that have been involved in this for quite a long time. So there are lots of people out there doing this, but as I said, in terms of animals, it's still been very new for people to take animals seriously. And the creative lives of animals is about really uses the research of biologists and ethologists and cognitive psychologists, comparative psychologists, neuroscientists, to really support the idea that animals are individuals, that animals are individual creative beings who we need and are essential to biodiversity. And not our biodiversity at large. And we, play a small part in that. Well, of course, in the Anthropocene, we've been playing a big part on that. But I think that people are realizing that we need to change. But we need to realize that animals, the beaver, for instance, is an aquatic engineer, and we can't do without them. One of the reasons, I wrote that book was that I was writing so much about animals as victims in industrial agriculture and experimentation. And I just really wanted to say that animals are much more than that. Animals of all kinds, I include, ants, oysters, things that people, really persons that really for a lot of people don't think of them as beings that are important.
Yeah. And we'll come back to this later, because that's an interesting observation, in that even by extending our compassion to non-human animals as victims of testing and research and farming, for example, we can still do that in quite a patronizing way that ignores their agency and the centrality of their experience. It's like a sentimental extension of caring for. It's another sort of objectification in a way. So that's a really interesting shift that we might come back to later.
Okay. Yeah. So that's the short story.
It's fascinating, and you've covered so many different aspects of human endeavor and thought, and it's been interesting. And I think you've prefigured some of the philosophy that we might explore now too.
Especially work in computer science, which was difficult for me, to say the least, because I am a totally, I would say in many ways, very intuitive person. So
different modes of thought.
A new experience.
Yeah. So let me drag you back to the first of these really big questions: what's real? So for many of my guests, that's a story about whether they grew up originally in a religious household, or one that was more supernatural or mystical or spiritual in some sense, or one that was maybe more naturalistic, scientifically focused, maybe atheist or agnostic, and how that side of their thinking has changed over time about, the nature of reality and how we should go about understanding it. So you can wind the clock back as far as you like to tell that story. It'd be fascinating to understand your journey.
I listened to a number of your interviews with people, and I just found it really fascinating to find what people had come from. I mean, I always think my background sort of, is on my being. It sort of shows, I'm Italian. I was brought up Italian Catholic. I shouldn't say this, but, in some ways, at least in our family, rationality was, well, my father was very rational. My mother, the rest of us were women. And it wasn't that we weren't rational, but we certainly used our emotion strongly to make decisions. And I say that with a bit of a, foot in my mouth. But and being Italian Catholic, of course, I was. There is this enormous, supernatural kind of. I mean, you can't get more, in some ways, both naturalistic and supernatural of, eating the body of Christ. I mean, it's very physically. It's a physical metaphor, but it also is, to Catholics, a real happening. But then it's about a spiritual being, and it kind of So, in some ways, I mean, I'm not a practicing Catholic. I would say that most of where I've gone and most of my thinking has been informed by Buddhism, but I wouldn't say I'm a practicing Buddhist either.
Yeah.
So, but I do think that there are many levels for me of what I have come to know as reality. I don't think that the naturalistic way of looking at things, it's really important. Obviously, I wrote that book, The Creative Lives of Animals.
Yeah.
But I also think
chock full of evidence and reasoning and scientific method, and
and which is kind of funny because I guess I have a background in computer science, but I'm not a scientist. I'm essentially an artist. But a lot of what in terms of looking for creativity itself is an unknown quantity in some ways. I mean, people have written about it, people have studied it, people say they know what it is. I don't think that we do know what it is. I have a feeling that it is, and I wrote about this in the book, that it is a universal quality that is not just for humans, obviously, but is, for, at least on this planet, very much about all the beings on this planet. And without them, we don't have a universal creativity. And what I'm hoping to do with the book is to actually talk about a universal multi-species creativity. But if you look at what we think of as reality, humans, I mean, you probably have a very different idea of what reality is than I do. I mean, my sister and I actually think that we were brought up in a different household. We have totally different memories.
Really?
She's like, oh, it was great. And I'm like, really? I don't quite remember it that way. But because I'm more of that kind of a person, I see things that way, where she sees everything as a positive. So, but I also think that and this is something that I I thought was really interesting in terms of talking about what is reality. Obviously, cultures have different ideas about reality. Religions have different ideas about reality. Beings on this planet have very different ideas about what reality is. I know Ed Yong's book is An Immense World is very popular right now for just that reason, that I think people are really interested in how other beings sense the world.
Yeah.
But I also think that I've always had for a long time, a real interest in conceptual physics. And the reason for that is kind of funny, sort of. I was in a really bad car accident when I was in my 30s, and I couldn't really do much. I was a printmaker, and I couldn't print. I couldn't really do much, and all I could read if I held the book up like this, because I couldn't bend my neck down. Not fun.
Yeah, sounds awful.
It was awful. But the good thing about it was that I read Annie Dillard's Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, an incredible book, American, but very much ahead of its time. And if you haven't read it, you have to read it. She's really wonderful. She's also, like Tom Regan from Pittsburgh, where I'm from, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, sort of not the place that a lot of people want to be from, but I'm proud of it. But anyway, I read her, and she talked about physicists that I had never heard of. And so I started to read conceptual physics and just anything I could get my hands on. And one of the things I did read at some point was On Creativity by David Bohm, and I read most of his work. And I used it in the book, is that his ideas about reality, I think, opened up a whole new world for me. And of course, physicists actually do that. I mean, physicists who think that the world is made of strings, and other people that think, and Einstein used to talk about, spooky action at a distance, which is not so spooky anymore. I mean, actually, just student physicists can make that happen. And that is, of course, that one particular action is connected to another action. Very simply, I'm going to the details.
At least at a subatomic level, yeah.
Yeah. And you're right. I mean, there is that idea that is only at a particular level. But I think that those levels exist. And I think when Bohm talks about the explicate order, which is kind of what we deal with, is enfolded into the implicate order, which is what I hate to say underneath, but the way he talked about it as enfolded. And he was very, very confident that we were all connected, and not just people, but things and nature, and in a way that, we're not aware of all the time. I think some people are very aware of it. And I think there are moments when perhaps even you would say to yourself, what's going on here?
Yeah.
And you don't know whether to follow that or not, because it's kind of scary.
Yeah. And one of the things I find fascinating about this sort of whole idea of epistemology is, I do think that there probably is just one objective reality that we all share that has a certain existence, that it ultimately is incontrovertible. And I think that, as we were talking about whether there are layers or different interdependencies, ultimately it's all just physics. And I don't mean just in a derogatory way. I mean, ultimately, that's what everything is. I think ultimately I'm made of subatomic particles, and maybe they're even made of something else too. So there is, I think, most likely one objective reality, even if it includes parallel universes and lots of things we don't understand. But I quite like focusing more on the methods of epistemology rather than I do on a definite conclusion about what is real. So I quite like, this is partly why I use the term evidence and reason, because I think we should build our credences based on evidence and reasoning. And that can lead us to some pretty crazy places, potentially. So one, like you and your sister, that can lead to different individuals with different experiences and different psychologies to have very different perceptions of this one reality we share. And when you go into the non-human animal kingdom, that can explode the possibilities of experience, into a radically various multidimensional range of things, all of which can still be, naturalistic ways of understanding reality. And I think it's a fair point to also say we should also be, quite humble about how much we do know and can know, which can leave us open-minded about whether there are other forms of connection or interdependency or things that we might today think of as magical that could actually turn to be real. And there are often parallels between people with a more mystical, spiritual way of thinking when they talk about how things are connected and the way I talk about things being connected, which is, well, physics says we're all connected. And ultimately, even an electron, in a sense, is everywhere all at once. And so there's different ways of connecting those, worldviews. But I'm interested in going back to where you started out with growing up Italian Catholic, as you said. I'm assuming that as you grew up, you believed the things you were told about God and heaven and hell, and you took on, the ethical rule book and the ethical guidance. Were those things that you just took on, or were you always skeptical? And how did you get to the point of coming to say, well, that's not something I believe in or subscribe to anymore?
Yeah, again, I'm sorry, I have all these stories. I'm a storyteller by nature, and I have to talk about things in terms of stories. I'm sure you noticed that from the book, right?
Yeah.
Story in there.
It's great.
I definitely believed for quite some time, up until I'd say about 10, maybe. And I was always a reader. I read from when I was like 3 years old. No kidding. And it helped that happen, because once you start reading, of course, you start to be critical of things, because one book doesn't really match up with the other books. So by the time I was, I think it was like 11 or 12, I was reading Ralph Ellison and Jerzy Kosinski. And now, this is the funny part. My parents, who were very protective, somehow never looked into what I was reading. So I could read whatever I wanted. And, Jerzy Kosinski, the painted bird, I mean, it's not something that really most 11-year-olds should. I don't know, should. I was like that with my son. I told him he could read whatever he wanted, look at whatever he wanted. Just let's talk about it.
Yeah.
And that's what we did. And he's now a novelist. So he also works with homeless people. So he has both sides. But yeah, I mean, I really started to be skeptical quite early. And I really, I did not want to go to Catholic school. I was brought up in a Catholic grade school. And by the time I hit 8th grade, I was like, I got to get out of here.
Yeah.
And I convinced my mother I should get out of here because I played the violin at the time. And I said, but there's no orchestra at the very devious child.
Yeah,
anyway,
good thinking.
And of course, then I got into the public school and I was like, hell with the violin. So, but in any case, yeah, very, very skeptical. And I still, I have to say, as intuitive as I think I am, and I know I am, I'm also very intuitively critical and skeptical. So that, even the Dante series, I was already sure that I knew that animals felt emotion and pain, and were really, I always had felt like they just were like us in those things. I mean, yeah, they were different, but there were ways in which we were the same. And I literally, when I picked up Dante again, I had read the Inferno before, but I had to read it again and take it apart for myself as I was taking apart animal experimentation. And I do that with everything. So I'm very slow. If I write a paper, I have to find, I can't just find even 3 sources. I have to find 8. And I don't think that's because I distrust myself, but I really want to feel that I understand something before, in other ways than just my own intuitive way. Because I think your attitude about being humble is critical. And of all the things that we need to do in this world is to be humble. And we're so bad at it as a species.
Yeah.
We really are. I mean,
which I sometimes think is born out of our own insecurity, and we overreact with a sort of arrogant human supremacy that has to put ourselves at the center of everything. It seems like a reaction to me, but yeah.
No, so I mean, what you were talking about is there are these levels, but it's all real.
Yeah.
Because it exists. So, I mean, in some ways, I was interviewed recently by Missing Witches, which is in Montreal, a group, a coven, Wiccas, basically. And, I mean, I'm not Wicca, but hey, Wiccas, I know lots of Wiccas and Wiccans, and they're very thoughtful about what they're doing, and it's a very a spiritual practice in lots of ways too, and ethical, and that's a big deal, and humble.
Yeah.
And I found that even though Catholicism keeps talking about humility, like I've always recognized a Catholic because if there's food and there's only one thing on the plate, you know who the Catholic is because they say, "No, you take it." Now, you're like, you're Catholic. But is that really how they are? Is it really how Catholicism is? No, it isn't. Yeah. So we do, as a species, just have a terrible time being humble.
Yeah.
What's interesting, I think, is that it's not, we can't look at animals and say they have it all figured out either.
Oh, no.
Well, they're struggling just like we are. And, they think of themselves very highly. And I don't remember the research on this, but that, and some species will look at the other species and say, ugh, we're so much better than in their own way.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, there's dangers in sort of reifying animals or reifying nature and assuming these things are perfect, and there is just no perfect model for us to look at, right? I think that's a dangerous path to go down. And just to wrap up this first section about what's real, what I'd suggest, just to play it back to you, and you can tell me if I've got this wrong or not. I sense that you probably do have a broadly naturalistic way of thinking because you want evidence, you reason carefully, and you're skeptical, and you want that humility that always has some doubt. And that's part of what led you to the skepticism that led you to turn away from, I guess, the Catholic beliefs and there being a hell and a heaven and deity, a tripartite deity, and that sort of stuff. That was that skepticism that led you away from that. But at the same time, your naturalism, the open-mindedness you have, remains open to things that others might call supernatural, right? Who knows? There might be something out there, and you do feel some affinity for this sense of connection or spirituality or otherworldliness to things like creativity or connection. Is that a sort of fair summary? It's broadly naturalistic, but open to going beyond.
I mean, it's just when someone says they are relentlessly naturalistic, I find that to be problematic because you're missing so much. I mean, I do think that animals, and there are many books on this subject, have a spiritual sense. And
I think it partly depends, I think, on what people mean by evidence and what they mean by reasoning, because I think some people say I'm relentlessly naturalistic, and what they mean is I only use scientific research, right? So unless there's been a randomized control trial or a Cochrane study or lots of people in white coats have done 15 papers on it, I won't believe it. And I tend to think of evidence and reasoning as much broader than that. I think of evidence as being any source of information about reality. So that includes your and my personal experiences. Right. I know this glass of water is here, and I haven't done any real science there, right? This is just my experience. So I think our experiences are evidence. And in the same way, I think reasoning isn't just sort of formal mathematical logic. I think of reasoning is in quite a broad sense that can include intuition and emotionally driven ways of thinking as well. And we should be skeptical of all of them, right? We should be skeptical of all sorts of evidence, including our own experience. And we should be skeptical of our own reasoning, whether it's formalized or emotional or intuitive, because we're just sort of evolved beings, right? We've no innate right to be correct about anything. So that humility runs through. So I think I might say I'm relentlessly naturalistic, but I use those terms in such a broad way that hopefully it leaves some of the space for the openness that you're keen to maintain.
You're not really relentless about
it. Yeah, maybe not. Maybe not. Relentless may seem a little bit too strong. I interviewed Barbara King, and she actually referred to herself in that way. But through the conversation, it's very clear that I think she would sort of share our, very rich openness to a variety of different experiences and ways of reasoning too. But
another thing that happens, and I find that people, and this is a big generalization, but I just, in my own experience, because this may be my next book, but I am a DES daughter. I don't know if you know what that is, and I'm not going to be able to pronounce what the drug is, but my mother took a drug when she was pregnant. At the time, I was born in 51, and they only banned it in 71 in the US. So with thalidomide, a lot of the genetic destruction was visible outside, while with DES, it all was sort of internal. So I have a defective kidney I was born with a defective kidney and 2 ureters. And so I find that people who have not been ill have a very different view of the world in some ways. I don't know too many people who haven't been ill, but I do know a few. And I'm always like, wow, that's so incredible, because they don't have doubt in a way. I mean, and again, I know I'm being very broad here, so please forgive, but I do think it's our experiences really form us in many ways. In all ways, and even though I have a very genetic reason for being who I am in many ways, I also then have feelings about that and ways that I've coped. And I feel I got off easy. I mean, compared to many women who did not, and still are not. And they're still doing research and finding things that women my age, because the women who took the drug were, of childbearing age in the 50s and 60s. So, and they didn't ban it. Now, and I guess what I'm getting at too is that, that doctors, medicine, at least Western medicine, is very, not really naturalistic, but it's based on rationality. It's based on data. It's based on, and yet I'll be honest with you, I have never felt for a long time that doctors, I've always been in a situation where, they just didn't know what was wrong with me. They didn't know what it was. And of course, later it probably was from the DES, but I've mistrusted, I guess. I don't trust medicine in the way that many people do, I think.
Yeah.
I'm a terrible patient now. I used to be a good little girl, but now I'm just a terrible patient. I drive any doctor that I see, and I see quite a few right now. I can tell they're like, oh God, here she comes again. Because I'm like, what about this and what about that? Because then I go and study things. I then read scientific papers,
and you're doing the research for them in some cases. And I've heard of that happening where, the patient is more deeply read in a particular medical topic than the general practitioner or the general doctor that, that they're talking to. And I think that's part of the problem with around mistrust of medicine is it's partly about how we deal with uncertainty. And I think if as a doctor you deal with uncertainty in an honest, open way, and you say, look, it's tough to say, but I don't know what's going on. The research is unclear. There's some indications. We're not sure, and I'm afraid we're just going to have to work with that. That's an easier way to build trust than it is to deal with uncertainty by pretending you're more sure than you really are and say, well, here's the study, here's the prescription, there's the answer, and then acting in denial when you don't wake up, when it doesn't work out. So
I think it also has to do with death. I mean, I find that if a person has not faced that in some way, in a real way, and I have a couple times, through the DES thing, and you really, it can be very earthbound, which is a great thing in a lot of ways. But, when you contemplate death, you definitely go in other directions, I mean, unless, it's sort of like, I don't know if you ever remember the TV show Dead Like Me, where, no, it's an American show with, what's his name? I can't remember, but the guy would give these little Post-it notes to the other dead people, and then they would go and they would be there when the person died so that they could explain to them what had happened to them and then take them wherever they were supposed to. So they were kind of in what Catholics call limbo, which
you can't escape your Catholic upbringing. Ultimately, it's still in there.
It's still in there. And believe me, if we have dinner, I'll say, "Oh no, you take the last piece."
The training runs deep. Yeah. That can be another, fundamental shift in people's perspective. And and for me, I think I'm just another biologically evolved animal that when I die, I will, my atoms will return to the earth in a physical sense, and I will cease to exist except in the memories of others. But other people take that into a very different direction. Yeah. But if you don't mind, should we move on to this second equally important question? And again, you've hinted at this already because it's so obvious that, one of the core themes of your life's work is activism and thinking about non-human animals. But one of the things I find interesting in these conversations, and you've probably picked that up from the ones you've listened to, is as people move from a religious worldview that comes with a package of ethics, the Bible, the Quran, and they move towards something that is either spiritual but not religious or more naturalistic, there is a sense of having to work out again what right and wrong, good and bad actually mean, and also as part of that, thinking about it in that moral sense. Okay, and who gets to matter? We all grow up with an intuitive concern for our family and friends and people like us and those around us, but over time that might develop to think about all other humans, and it might, as it has in your and my case, extended out beyond that to other sentient beings as well. So you've hinted at it already, but what was your journey in thinking about what right and wrong and good and bad actually mean, and who those concepts should apply to in our moral scope? How did you go through that journey?
Well, being brought up Catholic, I mean, the right or wrong thing is a big deal.
And in those days, did you see right and wrong as being ultimately about obedience to a deity? Or did you see right and wrong as being independent of the deity, but here are the rules in the Bible that define that for me?
Well, if you're an Italian Catholic, and I've tried to explain this to people, is I can't say there is no Bible, but the Bible played very little role in my home. It's just sort of you're of course you're Catholic, and of course it's very different. And I again, I kind of find that Italian Catholics, they're like, yeah, we're Catholic, but we also do this. And sex plays an enormous role, I think, in discovering that you don't really think that being Catholic would be a good idea, because then nobody would reproduce, So I mean, I have to say that part of that was learning, about sex and feeling, that this was wrong,
Yeah.
and you're just, and I was pretty sheltered, and I won't go into detail, but I had to really fight with that for a long time. I got over it, but it definitely, I think, is something that, again, like death, like coming into contact with death, coming into contact with sex, these very basic things that
Yeah.
we do, or that we are possible to, that, well, death, of course, is not just possible, it's definitely going to happen.
Pretty much, yeah.
But these things really start to trouble you, and certainly for me, I think that the idea that animals were not to be eaten, like, that was the first thing. I just was like, I had an uncle, actually my godfather was a butcher, and he was very upset when I first started saying, and I first thing I gave up, or said no. And veal was veal, and veal in Italian culture is like,
Yeah.
and we were not really that rich, so we'd have meat maybe once a week, but yeah, that upset everybody.
And was the trigger for you, a disgust response? Because some people, it's like, this is flesh, and it's more of a disgust response. Was it a compassionate, ethical response because you identified with the victims, or something else?
Yeah, it was that veal is a calf. It's a baby. You're eating a baby calf. You're eating a baby cow.
Why do you think you made that connection? Because again, you're growing up in a culture that saw that not just as normal, but also quite a special, important thing, right? That was, by definition, I'm a good person, we're good people, this is something we do, surely this is a good thing to do. Why do you think that sparked in your mind and not in others around you?
Well, I can't say exactly. I was always a weird little kid.
Most of my guests are weird in a wonderful way, but I like that. Yeah.
Yeah. And we all say we were kind of weird.
Yeah.
And now we get to talk about it. But I do think being ill probably had a lot to do with it. That really makes you feel quite different. While everybody's out playing, or everybody does this. And, for the first operation on my kidney, I was literally, and this was a long time ago, and this is what I guess, they did. I had most of my right kidney taken out. And I was in the hospital for a month. So you really learn to be very independent in your thinking. And actually, the next year was when I found out about veal calves, how they kept them in these little cages, which, they still do.
Yeah.
And forced milk and all, I was like, no. Mm-mm. And so it grew from there. I do feel that and I said before that I trust my intuition in lots of ways. And lots of times when I haven't trusted it, I regretted it. And now I trust myself to say, no, this is how I feel about it. And I think this is how I'm going to act about it. And I do think acting on that, back to activism, is really important. And it wasn't until, I felt that, also, you have to realize I was in college when the Vietnam War, people were protesting against. So that was a big influence, of course, in people in my age group. And what a lot of my students sometimes say is, well, you're still that way, but my parents are really different. And that was sort of before, when I was teaching high school, because I did teach high school for a while, which is also an incredible experience. My God, wonderful, but eye-opening. And then, that idea that you can't just, once you see something, you can't unsee it. And once you can't unsee it, you have to do something about it.
Yeah. Even if there are social pressures or challenges, it's a strong enough drive that you push through that.
Yeah. Also, and this is way off the mark, and it may be too personal, but in terms of always sort of saying, "Oh no, I'm not going to do that." Everybody in high school was doing drugs, and I was like, nah. First of all, I had all the drugs that I could want in the hospital, and I didn't like it.
Yeah. Mm.
And second of all, I was probably intuitively known that I was crazy enough as it was. I really didn't need this. But it also, I just became the kind of person who said, no, I'm going to do this. And, it hasn't always been easy, but I don't regret it. And for some reason, I guess I had some sort of, I wouldn't say a shield, but the idea that you were, when things got really bad in the art world, I would always listen to Martin Luther King and say, keep your eye on the prize.
Mm.
Keep your eye on the prize. The prize was that, and we may never reach it, that people will think differently about animals. They won't eat them. They won't wear them. They won't, use them as objects, as clothes, all the things, terrible things that we do to animals. And that was the prize.
Yeah.
And
there's a certain resilience that comes from that purpose.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And so it sounds like you I guess, grant moral consideration to animals, and you have compassion for animals, and that's flowed through so much of your work. What is it about animals that drives that? So this may seem like a technical definition for some people, because there's so much overlap between these terms, because on the one hand, there's a compassion for all animals, and there's also this compassion for all sentient beings. Now, the reason I care about animals is because of their sentience, because of their capacity to experience suffering and flourishing. That's, to me, what gives them moral status, because for me, morality is simply the choice to value the experiences of another as far as we can, in the same way they value their own experiences. So as soon as an entity can, the subject of a life, exactly. And is that your rationality for compassion for animals? Is it centered on their sentience? Would you use that sort of terminology in that concept, or is it something different?
Now that I've written The Creative Lives of Animals, why write a book if you know what you're going to write about? I mean, the exciting thing about writing a book or anything or making art is that it's a discovery.
Yeah. An exploration in its own right. Yeah.
If I could have said that before, yes, pain, suffering, but there's so much more to animals than that, as there are with people. And I definitely think that these things, I know some animal rights people really hate people.
Yeah.
Human beings. And I don't think you can do that. I think you need to see the connection between things. And certainly the way...
Yeah, we're animals too. We're sentient beings too. I mean, we qualify.
We mistreat, we have the choice, we have the ability, and so in many ways, animals do too, and they do make the choice to be compassionate sometimes, and sometimes they don't.
Yeah.
And
sounds familiar.
Sometimes if it means that they're going to eat or not eat, they make that choice to not be compassionate, but and go ahead and eat the other being, and that's fine. But I, as a this particular species, I have to live in this particular species as in this body as a human being. And again, if you see something, you can't unsee it. And then you have to do something about it. So I do think that these things are, compassion is central, I think. And the feeling that, that other beings have a life, and that would include for instance, even people who disagree with you and people who are, you feel you don't really want to hang around with. But also there's so many things that are wrong with the world. There always have been. I hate to say that, but even though right now part of me is like, my goodness, there's just so much going on, but there's a lot to do. And I find I get frustrated in some ways because my health is not always that I can do what I want to do. So I have to deal with that, but I can write about it. And art actually, I think can be a forum, art, writing, anything that, music, theater, things that speak to directly to not rationality, but to intuition, to the heart, can be very, very valuable in activism.
Yeah, I agree. And can we come back to that in a little when we talk about how to make a better world? Because I'd love to get your views on the role of art in activism and campaigning and driving change too. So, and I love the way you put this, I guess, focusing on suffering and flourishing as the sort of baseline, if you like. I think that's the only thing an animal requires to warrant our compassion, is that baseline sentience, even if they have nothing else, which of course they do, but they have so much more. And your work on creativity is mind-blowing. And one of the things that I found fascinating about the book was the sheer variety of different types of creativity, whether it was play, architecture, social relations, teamwork, putative democracy, tool use. I mean, the variety is absolutely mind-blowing. But how do you think a deeper understanding of non-human animal creativity links to our understanding of their sentience? How do you think they relate? Or do you?
No, I do. I think pointing out to people or giving people the opportunity to see animals of all kinds as essential and very powerful beings without whom we will be lost. And I think that's an important point to make. I just was lucky enough for the scientist. Again, I'm not a scientist really, but I like to point out. But gave me a chance to do an opinion piece about what's in the book, and that was the major issue, was that we are missing the boat with conservation if we don't consider animals as individuals, part of groups, part of families, groups, cultures. We need to protect all those things and to give animals the chance to do what they do best. And that is to foster biodiversity in all its forms. And in the article, I use the beaver because the beaver is such a good example, not just of creativity and of real professionalism. It's aquatic.
Workmanship and
Yeah, I mean, and it actually, I didn't know this until I did the research, was that beavers, when they make their lodges, they're like, oh, come on, you come in too. They have all these other little creatures that live with them. There's room enough. Oh, sure, we'll just make another. And the things that beavers do, I think, are amazing. And the other thing was to learn that aquatic engineers who happen to be humans actually think that forests grew up around the water that beavers worked in, so that they
shaped the landscape.
Yeah.
So one of the things I'm nervous about when we focus on creativity and intelligence is that some people will zero in on those things as qualifiers for moral consideration. So where their thinking goes is there might be simple animals that, yes, they might be able to experience suffering and pain in a very basic way, but unless they have these higher creative capabilities and ability to plan for the future, a certain level of sapience, a language, and you can see where this is going. Once again, we're special again. We don't need souls to convince ourselves we're special anymore. We can put ourselves at the top of a different pedestal that has creativity and intelligence and language. So you've already been clear that that's not the way you think, that even if an animal had a very basic level of creativity and intelligence, if they have sentience, they qualify for moral consideration already. But I don't know if you have any thoughts about that risk that people over-focus on, the fascination with creativity and intelligence.
Yeah, I think they do. And I think one of the problems is, as Marc Bekoff says, the question is not, is this dog, this breed of dog, more intelligent than that dog? I mean, that's not the question. It's not comparing each species to another or to us. The point is not to compare other beings to whatever we think is normal or we think is real. I mean, that's the problem with thinking that what reality is. And I do say in the book that, especially in the intelligence chapter, that, there's so many different ways of being and different ways of being intelligent. Teaching art in certainly in high school, or I taught junior high and then high school, and then went back to get my doctorate, and then taught from then on university students and graduate students. But I learned so much from the kids in high school, particularly because they had all different kinds of ways of being, and they approached things in very, very different ways. So I get your point. I do. But I do think that it's possible to be clear about that.
Yeah.
So that other people can understand it and then explain it to other people. I mean, when I was doing the Dante series, literally people would come to me and say, "Oh, did you do LSD?" And I'd be like, "No, that's number one, and number two, that's not what those pieces are about." There's always the risk. Once you put a piece of art, including a book, out there, it doesn't belong to you anymore. You sort of,
to some degree, you're going to lose control of people's interpretation, right? But that's part of the point. But I think the experience I got from reading a book was the opposite, because I found that by thinking about non-human animal creativity and these different forms of intelligence and their sense of agency and what it might be like to be as them and act as them in the world, actually gave me a richer appreciation for what their sentience might be like. Because I think as you imagine, always imperfectly being those beings interacting with the environment and with each other in these creative ways, you get a much richer sense of the nature of their sentient experience. And to my mind, sentient experience isn't just a sort of really simple pain-pleasure line. It's got the whole world of possible experience in there, existential angst and loss and love for a child and a sense of achievement and that's
a very, very different definition of sentience than many people have.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting because I don't know if you noticed, I described sentience in the book, and the idea that it initially meant to feel, and then that changed, and certainly, with behaviorism almost disappeared. But I mean, I think your very broad definition of sentience is very, very good. And that's what I meant in the book. And that's what I was trying to do.
Yeah. I think it's any valenced experience. So any experience that the entity feels anything positive or negative about. And that could be, a dazzlingly broad range.
The word that works, I think. People think, oh, well, oysters, they don't move, so they don't have any agency. Well, if you talk about oysters and you learn about them, you realize that's not true. they do have agency. I like, I mean, it's not that I don't like Sentientism. I've known that word for many years, and I certainly agree with it. And I like your definition of it quite a great deal. But I also am beginning to think about agency, because that idea that all, and then here's where people probably go, all of life has agency. I mean, if you listen to indigenous people talking about nature, talking about the world, they talk about mountains as having agency. They talk about trees. They talk about rocks. Everything, the water, the ocean has agency. So I think, I'm sorry, I'm just looking at the birds that have just come back to my tree for the first time in a long time. So I think that word too is really helpful.
Yeah.
Sentient somehow means to me, and I'm sorry, I'll just quit this in just a second, but I have to get it out. Sentient seems to be a more static word to me, and agency is an active word. So for me, I've been using agency because I want people to get the fact that you should get that meaning, that animals are active. And I'm sure, a sentience, I don't want you to, which of course you won't, suddenly stop and say, no, I'm going to use
I can rename everything. It's fine. It won't take long.
But, I do think that agency has a place in there, that idea that, and you are saying it.
Yeah. And I think for me, we can almost flip the thought experiment around, because we were talking about, is it possible to be sentient without having agency or intelligence or creativity? And I would suggest that, it might be conceptually possible, but it's probably unlikely, because I think sentience evolved for the same reasons intelligence evolved. It was adaptive to be able to model yourself and feel things that took you towards good things and away from bad things, right? So I think in a way, intelligence and sentience in the evolutionary are quite tightly bound up, and creativity, to my mind, is an extension of that. It's a flexible capacity within intelligence. But we can almost flip it the other way around and say, well, so I think there's a rich degree of overlap there. And I think our understanding of non-human animal agency, creativity, and intelligence can enrich our understanding of the range of their sentient experience. So that I'm all very comfortable with. I guess where I get a little bit more nervous is,
I love what you say, nervous. You're nervous about it.
I'm not nervous, but I think there can be some risk. Is if you flip it the other way around and imagine if there are entities that are not sentient, they have no experience at all, but we can still describe them as having agency or intelligence, particularly if you use quite minimal definitions of agency and intelligence. Because if you describe agency as, moving towards some goal, or you could even get to the point where, subatomic particles or mountains or rivers can have some sort of sense of agency because they're doing something. An electron is buzzing around the atom. Is that a sense of purpose, or is it's active in some way? You can if you describe intelligence very broadly as, the capacity to solve a problem, in a sense, a spreadsheet or a chess program can have a degree of intelligence. And my nervousness about, I like binding sentience and agency and intelligence in a sort of rich way of understanding non-human animals. But if we focus too much on agency or intelligence and we put sentience to one side, I think there's a risk that can, one, enable us to broaden our moral consideration to beings that have no capacity to care about that consideration, which doesn't necessarily need to be a problem, except that it might then flatten our moral landscape to the extent that you can say, well, if I care about agency and I care about intelligence, and here I have a pig that has agency and intelligence as it goes about its life, but here I have a blade of grass that has agency as it reaches towards the sun, and it has intelligence about how to solve for the angle of the sun, and therefore cutting a blade of grass is no different from cutting the throat of a pig. And can you see where I'm going? That this sort of super expansive moral consideration to every form of agency, if we forget about sentience, I'm worried.
One of the reasons that one of the, I guess, understandings, I would call it, because, as I said, I felt very humbled by what I discovered when I was writing the book. You know, you kind of feel like, geez, where have I been all this time? Is that creativity, at least the way I define it in the book, is a quality that is universal. And that universal quality is able to fit into very many different containers, all different shapes and sizes. And intelligence and creativity are, I would say that they are two different things. Creativity, I feel, is something, and I have to, I have the book here. And I just want to read something that made me stop and reconsider. Now, you may have read this, and I'm going to read just this part from David Bohm, because it really made me rethink what creativity was. And he says in Creativity, on Creativity, it cannot be too strongly emphasized that what is being suggested here is that intelligence does not thus arise primarily out of thought. Rather, as pointed out earlier, the deep source of intelligence is the unknown and indefinable totality from which all perception originates. And I say, that seemed very opaque to me until I reread Bohm when I started writing this book. And I asked myself, is the deep source of creativity the unknown and indefinable totality from which all biodiversity originates? Now, I specifically said biodiversity because I was talking about animals, but I also think creativity and biodiversity are, I think we have to go back to being humble again and saying, as you do often, we don't know. What if creativity, as we think, we think about it as a painting or, music or anything, but actually creativity could be something, and I feel is something that is profoundly important, but profoundly unknown, and profoundly affects how the universe exists.
So it could be as broad as including, galaxy formation or solar system formation or the evolution of the universe as a whole. I think of it in a deeply expansive sense. Yeah.
And I'm sure I can just hear, I can just hear them now on my right side and my left side. But that's just a word. That's just a word, creativity. Yeah, that's true. But when we think about, if we think about creativity in that, ineffable way, I think we might have some understanding of what matters. So that in many ways, if you're really humble about it, everything matters.
Yeah.
And if everything matters, oh my God, what do we do about that?
Yeah.
I don't know. I know that there are certain things that I feel absolutely need to be considered, but maybe my thought is too limited as well.
Yeah.
And at some point we might understand, for instance, we were talking before about how people might consider animals, as creative, and then suddenly it would be, well, this dog or this bee is more creative. But the idea is not to look at things like that.
Yeah.
So changing thought is incredibly difficult. entrenched thought and assumption, incredibly difficult thing to do.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I did it in this book, but I spent 10 years on it.
Yeah.
And I certainly changed my thought. So in some ways, it, I suppose, was a success, but, I think being open to other ways of definition, just to enlarge the definition of creativity, to include other beings. And, like I think I say towards the end of the book, and I'm not even talking about plants, I mean, that's something that came to me too. I didn't have that feeling really until I started to write the book and began to do the research. And, the interconnection between plants and animals is so profound and then you have to realize that both are essential.
And I think for me, I think interestingly, there's quite a lot of parallels between your style of really richly expansive, redefinitional thinking about creativity. And you start from where we might intuitively think about creativity, and you'll consider non-human animals and plants and maybe ecosystems and maybe galaxy formation. And you can, in a way, take it all the way. There's a parallel between that sense of, very expansive thinking, actually, in a very sort of materialistic, scientistic way of thinking about the world that says ultimately we're all quarks and quantum fields evolving. It's just physics, and that's the end of the story. And I think both have value, and ultimately they're probably both right in that sense. They're almost different ways through. Where I'm nervous is that either route can risk ending up in a nihilistic place, where we say everything matters, everything is connected, therefore nothing really matters in any distinctive way. Therefore, we just sort of, we've almost there's a risk we might give up on ethics and morality. And that's partly why I can appreciate those views about the nature of reality and how it's connected, and use it very expansive thoughts about creativity and intelligence and how things work together in a physical sense or in a way we might think is ineffable. But when it comes to morality, that's why it does draw back to me to valuing the experiences of others and the creativity and intelligence that is involved there. So that's partly why I do tend to draw back to sentience as that baseline starting point, to say, however we understand the universe and its interconnection, and its richness, there is something distinctively important about an entity that can value its own experiences.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I do think that, it's funny because I did a conference 2011 called Animal Influence. And the idea was to bring artists together and have scientists and biologists and philosophers come. And it was great. And Marc Bekoff, I asked him to be one of the keynotes. And we were sitting at a table with an artist, after, I don't know, it was dinner, I guess. We didn't get Mark and I both had French fries because there wasn't anything else for us to have because we're both vegan. And wine. So that made it better. But, we were talking, and I think we were talking about what was most important, creativity or compassion. And Mark and I both said at the same time, compassion. And just that tone of voice too. Each other, oh yeah, we do really understand each other. And I do think that all that wonderful, expansive thinking is not valuable if compassion is not involved. And that's where what's real and then what matters, or who matters, comes into that important question, and really is profoundly important because, yes, to be honest, when postmodernism was really the thing, it really just didn't do anything for me. I felt like even then that I was like, oh, you're so old. I was like 40, so I wasn't. But I just felt that it was so pluralistic. I must have a lisp coming up. And that was the problem too. And the idea that, which of course, I think has gone out of favor, is that, everything is fine and there's really no right or wrong. I mean, that, what I think, it's certainly academics, I think, are not going that way now. And postmodernism has now passed. But I do think that those two things go together. And that's why your question, what is real and what matters, or who matters, what matters as a more general sense, are so important to take together.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, some people like to try and keep them separate, but I'm not sure it really makes sense, right? If your ethics and morality aren't grounded in reality, they have no grounding at all, arguably. And some people will reach for a supernatural grounding in that sense, but I think that leads us just as astray as something that's totally relativistic or nihilistic. Yeah. Well, that was fascinating. Thank you. It was really interesting to explore that with you, because I think we probably end up coming back to a sort of similar place to say ultimately compassion is the core of it. Yeah. So the final crazily big question we ask is about how can we make a better future? So, and your work has spanned so many different, like, if you like, levers of change, right? Academia, science, writing, visual and creative arts, activism. How has all of that left you thinking about the best ways of driving positive change? And do you feel optimistic, pessimistic, or something else about our prospects for making things better for all sentient kind?
I do feel very optimistic when I look around and I, just don't think about just what I'm doing, but what other people are doing. And see all these younger people, particularly, but also, older people who are very much involved in thinking about these things and thinking about not just animal rights or the moral necessity of thinking about animals, but just in general, this idea that we are in all this together and this planet needs protecting. This is a very critical time to actually do something. And you look at, just so many people out there who are involved in this. And then I feel optimistic. So and of course, there are times when I feel very pessimistic. And part of that is when I look at all the things that are still happening, I still get, and I belong to organizations, I sign up for stuff. And so I get all these images and this information about, how animals are treated and how human beings are treated, and how and of course you just have to listen to I hate to admit this, but I still have to watch the news at 5:00. I don't have a TV, but I watch it online. And sometimes I'm like, this is so depressing. I don't think I can watch it. But, in some ways, I feel like if I don't do that, I get so involved in my own activities. I read the New York Times every morning. I read the Guardian. I try to read a lot of things that don't have anything to do with what I'm interested in. I just had a great time.
And it is difficult because the news has sort of inbuilt negative bias. Good news and progress often doesn't hit the headlines in the same way as bad news does. But
yeah. I just had a grandson, and
congratulations.
Thank you. My son is a vegetarian, almost vegan, but not quite. Was vegan for a while, went back. But he's definitely, very political. He works with homeless people. So that, and his wife does too. And, that makes me optimistic. And they just had this wonderful young little baby. And Giovanni. We named him Giovanni. That was Calder's decision, not mine. That's my son's name. So I was really pleased. But I've often said this. I am not going to be around to see people's attitudes really change towards animals. I think it will. I'm keeping my eye on the prize.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I won't be here to see it. At least I won't be here in this form.
You might be uploaded to a server somewhere, running on a computer.
Coming back to haunt everybody. That's
Well, just traditional haunting may work. Yeah.
So I am, but yeah. So both.
Yeah.
And I think Martin Luther King's amazing person, had it all right. You keep your eye on the prize, otherwise it's too discouraging. Otherwise you'll give up hope, and you can't give up hope.
Yeah, whether you're pessimistic or optimistic, the important thing is you keep working. Yeah, and I think there's some fascinating work done by looking at historical social change movements, and they always feel too slow to the people who are trying to make them happen. They always feel too fast to the people who are resisting. And certainly on the animal topic, nearly everybody is resisting at the moment. But when you reach a certain point, things can tip remarkably quickly. So, yeah, we'll see. We'll see.
I will have to tell you that over the years, my experiences, I can hear you can't hear her, I don't think. Can you hear her?
No, I just heard a hint of a bark. Yeah.
Yeah, she's mad at something. I don't. But over time, over the long period that I've been vegan, 25 years, and vegetarian before that, and involved in animal rights, I've seen a big change. I've seen an enormous change.
Yeah.
So
there's hope there.
I am hopeful.
Yeah, that's great. And I will let you go in a moment because you've been so generous with your time. But
it's been wonderful.
A lot of these conversations, when we're in this section, we talk about the sort of classic stuff, right? Persuading people to go vegan and individual activism. We talk about institutional change levers and policy and subsidies, and we talk about economic alternatives, for example, plant-based meats and those types of things. And we talk about the intersections between animal ethical causes and human ethical causes and all of those types of things. But I just wondered if you had a thought about the role of the creative arts in driving change too, because that's something that most of my guests don't dwell on that much. What do you think that writing and creative and visual arts can do?
I think the arts and creative practices play an enormous role in change. And if you look at the history of change, you through time, you realize that artists have played an enormous role, because it sneaks up on you. These ideas sneak up on you through the arts. And whether it's you're reading a book, I mean, I first heard about being an animal rights person reading actually another book by Jerzy Kosinski. One of the characters was an animal right, and I was like, wow, you can do that. Oh, I was very young, but it was a thing. It was a thing. I could do that. And yes, I think that art does change, plays a big role in change. That's hard for artists to take on. I think a lot of artists really don't want to take on that kind of responsibility. And okay, I understand that. And in some ways they say, well, it makes for terrible art.
Yeah.
I don't think that's true. If you really look at some of the things that we value, books, paintings, symphonies, they certainly have to do with, they've taken on that responsibility. And you talk about music, really? Yeah, music too. Theater. I did and I'll just leave you with this, I did my dissertation on, it was called Aesthetics of a Virtual World, Ethical Issues in Virtual Environments, virtual environments. And I used Brecht as a model, theatrical model for virtual environments. So the central issue was that if you look at Aristotle, it's like destiny. You have to take this on. This is your destiny. Too bad. Brecht was saying, you have the ability to change and change the future.
Yeah.
So I like that. And I think, you have to keep that in mind. Everything we do makes a little change. And I finally gave up yelling at people or lecturing them a long time ago. And now I just model behavior.
Yeah. Yeah.
It just, it's not all successful, but it's made changes here and there.
Yeah. And the ripples flow out. Yeah. The ripples flow out. Yeah. Well, thank you. It's been a real inspiration to talk to you and hear your.
Lovely to talk with you. You're really, really a wonderful host in that you just are so generous with your thinking and with your time. So I've really enjoyed this.
Thank you. It's a privilege and an honor. Yeah. So what's the best way of people following you, learning more about your thinking, and of course, buying your book when it comes out on the 22nd of November? And hopefully I'll be able to time the release of this so it will synchronize with your launch.
Thank you. The book on New York University Press, or God forbid, Amazon, indie book, bookshop, all over. It's all over, and you can read it on Kindle or whatever your electronic book reader is, or hardcover. And the cover is by Melissa Grew. She's a photojournalist, wildlife photojournalist, and it's
beautiful.
The Amazon woman that I've always wanted to be and have not been able to. She's really amazing. And my website is basically just carolgigliotti.com. And sooner or later, I'll have my graphic novel site up, where I have been working on a graphic novel for an animated one online for quite a while and got sort of pulled away. So
yeah, wonderful. I look forward to it. And the book is The Creative Lives of Animals. So is there an audiobook coming out soon too? Are you going to be reading your own audiobook?
I have seen it. I know that somebody must have bought the rights. Academic presses. So
yeah.
All this stuff goes on, and it's not my choice, but I'm sure it'll be a good audiobook. I mean, I've kind of looked up the woman who wants to do it or is doing it. She seems great. So.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, I loved it. I loved reading it. So yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thanks. That really means a lot to me. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for taking the time to join Sentientist Conversations. And it's wonderful to have you on our I'm a Sentientist wall on the website as well. So
I am.
Yeah.
I am too.
I think you can. After this conversation, I'm going to claim you. So yeah.
Thank you so
Brilliant.
much.
Thank you so much. Please stay in touch, Carol. Take care.
Thanks, Jamie.